Welcome to Fire University. This is a podcast dedicated to fire ecology and management within the Natural Resource University Podcast Network. My name is Dr. Marcus Lashley. I'm a wildlife biologist, an assistant professor of disturbance ecology at the University of Florida, and a lifelong hunter that's passionate about wildlife conservation and management. In this podcast, I will interview scientists and professionals not only on the latest research in fire ecology, but also about their experiences in hopes that you as the listeners can learn why fire ecology is important and also how you can use it to meet your natural resource management goals. So let's get to the burning questions in Fire University. Hey everybody, welcome back to Fire University. Today, I'm going to switch gears a little bit. We've gotten a lot of feedback and questions and thoughts from the audience, which we really appreciate. We encourage you to give us that feedback because we go and target people to talk to on the show based on it, and that's what you're getting today. So we focused a lot on game species up until now, but we're going to switch gears a little bit and talk to someone who is a real expert in the area of using fire to manage non-game species. At least that's the way I think of her. And we have Dr. Katie Greenberg here today, who's a research ecologist with the Forest Service. So thanks, Katie, for coming on the show. We really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, so like I said, I know our audience, it seems like based on the feedback, a lot of people have interest in game species, and of course they're interested in using fire. A lot of them are private landowners, but we have some practitioners that are in the natural resources as well. But I've been getting pretty consistent feedback that we need to get some non-game, focus on here to talk about some other species. So I know you've done quite a bit of work up in the Southern Appalachians is what I'm most familiar with, but you've done some work in longleaf systems as well, I know. So I just wanted to have you on the show and pick your brain about some of those things.
All right, sounds good.
So over the years, you've been involved in quite a few projects. So I guess, is there one in particular that has stuck out in your mind that really encapsulates the role of fire in our systems, especially for a suite of non-game species?
Well, I guess one of the things that captured my imagination in the Southern Appalachians, at least, is a study that myself and a lot of colleagues and grad students did on how fuel reduction treatments affect animals and plants. Mm-hmm. It was actually a multidisciplinary study. And in that study, we looked at low severity prescribed burns as one method of fuels reduction, but also we had an accidental high severity prescribed burn because one of the treatments was to mechanically cut the fuels, the small mm-hmm. trees and shrubs, and then a year later burn. So that burn a year later, after having the fuels cut and curing on the ground for a year, turned into a high severity burn, which turned out to be a very interesting contrast. And mm-hmm. then there was also a third fuels reduction treatment, which was just the mechanical thinning without a burn. Mm-hmm. And we had controls so that we had a good scientific experimental design. And this was all replicated as well. Mm-hmm. So that gave us the opportunity to look at the huge contrast, just honing in on the fire treatments between low severity burning and high severity burning in the Southern Appalachians. And between myself and a lot of other people, as I said, it takes a village to study things in nature because it's a ton mm-hmm. of work.
It takes a community to study a community.
Exactly. We looked at breeding birds. We also looked at reptiles and amphibians. We had someone else who looked at arthropods and so on. And where we found the biggest differences between these fuel reduction treatments was consistently, for almost all of these taxa, it was consistently between the high severity burning and the low severity burning. And basically we found, I can tell you more specifics if you want to talk about birds or specific sure. taxa, but basically low severity burns had very little impact on practically anything, whereas the high severity burns had a very noticeable impact, which was positive. on most of these taxa.
Oh, that's interesting. So
Yes.
when you say no impact, that's positive or negative. You basically, whatever species and whatever abundance they formerly were, they didn't really change when you.
I don't want to generalize too much across the taxa, but let me focus in on birds because that's the one I get the most excited about.
Hey, we're all about excitement. Whatever's most fun to talk about, let's roll it.
Well, the reason I get the most excited about birds is I really think they give the best window into ecology and how things respond to habitats. A lot of taxa is just kind of a unclear response. You can't really tell, what they're responding to. But with birds, it's really obvious. They respond to habitat structure.
Yeah.
And so let me focus on those.
Sure.
What we found was breeding bird species richness, diversity, total abundance did not change very much in the low severity burns. But in the high severity burns, it went skyrocketed. But there were more species after a 2 or 3 year delay. There was a delayed response, but after about 2 or 3 years after the high severity burns, we found more species in the high severity burns, more birds, like way more birds, and species occurred there that didn't generally occur in the other treatments, like in the low severity burns, particularly some disturbance-dependent species like indigo buntings and chestnut-sided warblers didn't occur at that low elevation. I'm blurring my studies, but eastern towhees, indigo buntings, and then we had just not enough. They weren't common enough to analyze, but you'd find a prairie warbler or a red-headed woodpecker or a chipping sparrow or an eastern bluebird also coming into these, which really boosted up the species richness in the high severity burns, but not in the low severity burns.
So even for the species, it was just a handful here and there. Those rare birds that you detected, those were all still in the high severity?
Yeah, pretty much. And so some substantially increased. The birds that were common enough to look at, like indigo buntings, they substantially increased in the high severity burns, but not in the other treatments. But we also got this little influx of other species that were infrequent enough we couldn't really tell if there was a population trend or a change in abundance, but we could tell that they were there, but they weren't there before.
Yeah. You at least started detecting them. So that's some indication that things changed.
Right. So, and another interesting thing about that study is over the 16-year study, we were able to do 4 repeated burns.
Yeah, I was going to ask about that.
Yeah, in the low severity treatment and in the high severity treatment. The subsequent burns weren't high severity anymore because, the conditions weren't right. But, well, we could still look at the effect of.
And it wasn't intentional either. Even from the first high severity, you said that was unintentional. But I guess you're getting to this. That was my question, was going to be, okay, where did you have repeated high severity? And you're saying no. But I guess the next logical question is where you were going probably. Did you actually see that effect carry out through the longer term, even though the repeated fires were low severity?
Yes, because I think the repeated fires were able to see what the birds were responding to, I believe, looks like it's correlated pretty closely, was in the high severity burns, it killed a huge number of trees, like, a massive percentage. I would have to look back at exactly how many, but so there were, the canopy was reduced substantially, the amount of shade. There was a lot more light coming in. There were a lot of dead trees around, snags, which a lot of wildlife like. And the repeated burns were able to keep those open conditions. And when you have those open conditions, the shrubs respond like crazy. Blackberry comes in and stump sprouts of the dead trees resprout at the stump in response, and seedlings of certain species come in as well. The mountain laurel, the rhododendron sprouts back immediately, and you get this huge shrub response. So what I think they were responding to is a combination of the dead trees, and then once you give it a chance give a little bit of time for the shrub layer to respond, I think that's probably what these early successional species are cueing into, or disturbance-dependent species.
Sure.
And the repeated fires were able keep that open forest structure. Whereas if you did repeat the fires, the young trees and the sprouts and stuff would start to grow up, and then this forest would eventually start to thin out, and the trees would start to mature, and pretty soon you don't have those early forest conditions or the young open conditions. So I think the repeated fires were able to keep that. Interestingly, though, the snags fell. Like within 10 years, there weren't very many snags standing that had initially been killed by the high severity burn. And the high species richness and diversity and the disturbance dependent, that didn't change. That continued. As long as the open conditions were there, the presence or absence of abundant snags didn't seem to change a whole lot, which I think is really interesting.
Oh, yeah, no doubt. So I guess to add some clarity to this, essentially you had a closed canopy hardwood system. I'm assuming it probably had a park-like understory where it's open. Is that?
No, it wasn't a woodland or anything like. It was just a southern Appalachian forest that, in fact, it was a good place to study fuels reduction because there was a lot of mountain laurel or rhododendron. It was kind of, intermittently. You could walk through some of it pretty easily, and then you'd find a patch of thick shrubs and stuff like that. But it was,
so that's what your control looked like, in other words.
Yeah, it was just it's easy for me to picture it because I'm used to it, but let me try to describe it. It was just closed canopy. You could walk through a lot of it there's plenty of leaf litter and stuff. And then occasionally you'll come to a thick patch of rhododendron or mountain laurel, depending on the topography, that type of thing.
Okay. Yeah, I'm just trying to paint that picture. And then when the low severity fire, you reduce the fuel load underneath that closed canopy, but the sunlight is limiting the response from the other shrubs and stuff, right?
Right. And I would defer to fuel experts regarding how the fuels responded. But I can tell you that our forests are they're not like a lot of, you can't generalize when you talk about responses across different ecosystems. Sure. They're very different, and species are different, but also the responses of the forest structure is different.
Yeah.
And so the fuels in our productive southern Appalachian forest, they rebound really quickly. The forests are deciduous, so leaves fall the very next year or the very next autumn, and that replenishes the leaf litter. The shrubs sprout back. And even the burn shrubs, if it's a low severity burn, there's still a lot of twigs. The structure of the shrub is still there, but not with the leaves.
Yeah.
So there still appears to be a lot of fuel, and then it rebounds pretty quickly. So I'm not going to, since I'm not an expert and there are experts, I'm not going to really focus on that. But there's,
I didn't mean to try to draw focus to that particular aspect. I was just trying to use your treatment description. But I was just trying to think about, okay, what's happening in the forest? What does that structure look like? And then the high severity fire killed a lot of trees, which I'm thinking of transitioned it sort of to a woodland structure where you have a lower density of trees and a lot of sunlight penetrating. And in that case, a lot of snag standing, at least initially.
Yeah. And again, terminology matters because you're probably thinking of a woodland in a certain, like what I think of as a woodland is the kind of thing that you studied, which is, what a lot of people are trying to restore is an open canopy with like a grass herbaceous understory. And that's not what happens here at least in my studies. I'm not going to generalize to others because I think Craig Harper's achieved certain things in East Tennessee and stuff like that. But here, what you get is just a vengeful response of the shrubs. It's just thick with blackberries and stump sprouts. It's not this nice walk in the park with a lot of grass and a flower here and there.
Well, you're saying what I studied. You're failing to realize how miserable it was on the side of the mountain when I was out there measuring the forage response. So I studied a few of the treatments, silvicultural treatments, just for the audience. I don't know if they know that, but for my master's project. And I would say some of those treatments are very similar to what you were describing, where it was a pretty dense shrub layer, basically head tall of something that was a nightmare to try to collect all the deer forage on.
I bet.
So some of the treatments, there were some that actually are more similar to what you were just saying, where it's herbaceous dominated. We did have some treatments that's what it was more like, but yeah, I can understand what you're talking about, that mess of shrubs and brambles.
Yeah, I think for a lot of researchers, if you were standing out looking into the study area, you wouldn't see a thing except maybe a hand sticking up and a bunch of cuss words coming out.
Yeah, wrapped up in blackberry and greenbrier.
Right. And also, Marcus, the another interesting thing is even after 4 repeated burns, we still did not get that woodland response. It was still coming back with vengeful, shrub recovery. And
right.
One thing that is interesting,
and
though,
when I was just to revisit that, when I was thinking of woodland, I was actually thinking of that, where you have that shrub response and you're just repeatedly hitting it with fire to try to keep it at bay. But you still have that really, I guess, a low density of trees relative to closed forest. So but it sounds like that's what you're describing. But it is interesting to think about what that term means. And
yeah, I mean, it was a low density of trees because they were killed. But if you left it alone after that, it would not be a low density after a while. After 10 years, it'd be very high young trees. And then after that, it would become fewer young trees, but more widely spaced and larger. But there would still be a full canopy probably.
Yeah. So I just want you to speculate unless you have data on it, that's fine. If you had the high severity fire and then you just left it alone, how long do you think the birds would be there before they're gone? The new ones that colonized.
Right. Well, I can draw inferences from another study I did, which was of shelter woods.
Mm-hmm.
And these stands were cut, and then we monitored, or we did bird surveys for 16 years after shelter woods compared to controls. Not exactly the same as a high severity burn, but a lot of the structure is analogous because you have few live trees and you have the same thick shrub response. So really, when you're looking in, it looks pretty similar, except for the absence of snags, abundant snags. And even those disappear over time after a high severity wildfire.
Sure.
So we were able to monitor again with partners, and this was actually part of a fleshy fruit study where we were also looking at fleshy fruit production.
And
I
know those well.
I know you do. A PhD student with Drew Lanham and Mariah Whitehead, they started the bird work. And after she finished, we continued with the surveys for another 14 years to add up to 16 years. And what we find is probably after 8 or 10 years, all of the disturbance-dependent species have gone back to the same level they would be in the wood, which isn't very many. But interestingly, different species, because I'm starting to look at the data now, even though it's a little late, but different species drop out at different years. Different disturbance-dependent species drop, which is kind of good.
So it's like a succession of species. You're transitioning out of the disturbance-dependent, but that's interesting. So they're at different rates of going missing.
Slightly different rates, and I don't have the significance values yet, but you can see it.
Yeah. Well,
another thing I want to point out is for most bird species didn't respond at all to high severity or low severity. They were equally as abundant in all of the treatments. So there are very few species that are negatively affected by high severity wildfire, and nothing's affected by low severity wildfire, as I said. But if you have high severity or prescribed fire, most species don't respond at all. So they stay there. It's the influx of other species that makes the abundance and richness go up. Now, there are some adverse effects on one or two, or maybe, but that's a little bit iffy. I'm seeing as I do more and more studies, but a lot of studies do show that oven birds don't like these young open stands. And I think that's probably true, although in a couple of my studies, I have not found that response. And maybe some ground nesters might show a short-term decline, but they rebound quickly after the things start to recover. So it's not like serious, especially when you're doing fires at a relatively small scale compared to the landscape. Then you habitat for everything if you do different management activities in different places within the same landscape.
Right. So, you kind of touched on something. I had two general lines of questioning that were coming to mind when I was listening to you, and you just touched on one of them. The response, do you think that that's a scale dependent thing? So in other words, if you set the entire state of North Carolina, you can pick a state, whatever, if the entire forest burned in a high severity, that's very different than it being, a 10-acre burn or this high severity, or, there's some degree of scale dependence there. And I wonder how much of that, is there a scale at which the high severity fires might become very negative, or do you think that those species are just doing fine regardless of that scale?
Well, I think probably if you had a high severity burn, for the entire state of North Carolina.
That's a facetious example, but it makes the point.
The entire western part where it's deciduous, mostly, or peanut. You might find a dip in ovenbirds and a couple of other species, but I don't think it would last terribly long because they can fly. I'm not even sure of that, because that takes me to another study that Chris Moorman and I and Mark Hopi and some people from Coweta and Katie Mark, a bunch of people are looking at wildfires in the Nantahala National Forest. And these wildfires burned across, they were mixed severity.
Mm-hmm.
So we took 3 burned watersheds that had a gradient of fire severities from low to high. And we also looked at 3 unburned watersheds. So we had the unburned contrast. And we did bird surveys over a 5-year period right after the 2016 wildfires that burned a lot of the southern Appalachians.
Yeah.
You'll recall it was a huge drought.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I know. That was a crazy fire.
Yeah. So in that particular study, ovenbirds did not show a dip in the low severity patches, but we looked at a whole gradient. And in that study, we did find a strong response by the 3 disturbance-dependent species, Indigo Buntings, Chestnut-sided warblers, and eastern towhees.
Mm-hmm.
They loved the high severity patches. They were more abundant in the high or moderately high severity patches.
Mm-hmm.
And they were not very closely associated with anything that was lower severity than that.
Mm-hmm.
And again, most species didn't respond. They were equally as abundant in all of the severity patches.
Yeah.
So I'm not sure that people talk about pyrodiversity and how pyrodiversity would be good. And that actually, it builds on a theme that wildlife biologists have had for decades, which is landscape. They might not have called it that. They called it edge back in the day, if you'll recall. Edge and contrast and juxtaposition and things like that. And that would increase diversity. Well, now what they're focusing on is pyrodiversity, which is the same diversity, only it's created by fire.
Yeah.
And based on what I've learned and studied over the years, I think that if you have diversity, whether or not it's created by fire, I think you're going to get the positive response by breeding birds to it.
I think, that's something that I allude to, especially while I'm teaching these kinds of concepts in the classroom. Historically, we can argue over what we're talking about historically, but fire probably at some point in history was a primary driver of heterogeneity and diversity, and structure and everything that begets this diversity you're talking about in birds or other species. So it may have been a process that influenced biodiversity as a whole on the landscape scale from fire. And then we have other practices where we can sort of mimic those disturbances to create the same kinds of changes in structure that may not be fire related, but you can generate it with fire or with other practices. It sounds like what you were saying.
Or with silviculture, and that's probably a lot of forest managers would prefer to get some value out of their timber.
I can certainly relate to that. So that brings me to the other line of questioning that I thought of a few minutes ago. and I think you've sort of captured it in some of your discussion, but I was wondering, okay, we've got this high severity fire that is essentially just releasing sunlight to the forest floor, along with other fire effects that went with the high severity. But that sounded like one of the major things that happened that influenced all these species of birds. Do you think or do you know if you went in and killed some trees because you harvested them in some sort of silvicultural system and then used fire at a low intensity repeatedly thereon, would you expect a very similar response from the birds?
Yes, I do, because well, the literature shows, not just my work, mine's later, but some of the literature from 30 years ago shows that if shelter wood harvests or other kinds of harvests that substantially reduce the canopy cover, you're going to get what I see as a very similar response to the high severity wildfire. And if you did fire subsequently, I guess you could maintain that open structure like we were talking about. So yeah, I really do think there would be very few differences. There might be a few. I'm not even sure about cavity nesters. The obvious difference between taking out the trees and killing the trees but leaving them standing through fire would be the abundance of snags. Yeah. And I'm beginning to even wonder if that has a massive effect, because like I mentioned before in the fire and fire surrogate study, as the snags fell, the cavity nesters remained there. And what I've seen in this wildfire study, Chris and I haven't had a chance to discuss it yet, so he may not agree with me, but I looked at just the woodpecker response. And if you just look at the primary cavity, they're the ones that excavate cavities out of dead trees. There wasn't a big response by woodpeckers alone. Of course, there weren't a ton of woodpeckers. If you don't have enough of them it's hard to see a trend. You have to get common enough species or common enough groups like woodpeckers in order to really legitimately look at it statistically when it comes to science. We had like 45, which is okay, observations. Be better if you had 300. Sure. But looking at that small sample size, I did not see a huge spike in primary cavity nesters. But when you look at it as a huge group that includes secondary cavity nesters like tufted titmice and chickadees and things like that, you saw an increase in cavity nesters with the snags. But as I said in another study, I did not see that they declined after the snags fell. So I don't know if it's a relationship between snags or just the open conditions or a combination, or if there's a critical threshold above which it doesn't matter if you have more and more snags, as long as you have some. It's hard to tell. That warrants further research.
Yeah, I agree. Well, I was even thinking about it from a meta-analysis standpoint. I don't want to get too much into the science weeds because I know some of the audience doesn't want to get into that. But basically, if we did an analysis of the studies, kind of using them as units, there's a bunch of studies looking at bird community responses to high severity wildfires that probably generated lots of snags like you're talking about, in comparison to an analogous silvicultural treatment like a shelter wood, where you're removing the wood instead of leaving it standing dead. So there may even be enough information out there to draw that conclusion of whether or not you see some of those primary and secondary cavity nesters in the silvicultural treatment. It's kind of
that would be very interesting, and I think you just outlined our next collaboration, Marcus.
Oh, yeah, more than happy. So it is interesting that we have collaborated directly and indirectly for basically my entire career. Is Chris Moorman, for those out there, that was my PhD advisor at NC State, and for a little while for a postdoc before I went on into academia. So and I know you've worked with Chris for a long time, and you've worked with Craig Harper, who was my master's advisor at Tennessee. So
I've worked with Craig more indirectly. He's invited me into a couple of things by contributing data, but I haven't really launched a study with Craig.
Yeah, I got you. Well, I know I was part of one of those indirect relationships when we did some of the oak masting studies, which I know you've done quite a few things on, and I have been involved in, and now have a long-term study on oak masting going right now.
Wow, cool.
So
That's great.
yeah, we've aligned several times on different aspects of these same questions. But yeah, that I think that's a really interesting thing to think about. I talk about it in this context, actually, in the classroom, as we do a lot of things to manage habitat for wildlife. And whether we're trying to or not, many of the things that we go in, these silvicultural treatments, fire, that one's probably more intentional than some of the others, but we really are mimicking natural processes that probably promoted the structure of plant communities that those species do well in. And whether we're trying to or not, we are emulating natural processes that would generate that. So it's interesting to figure out how well they align and where they don't, which in this case might be the snags.
Yeah, that's interesting. But actually, when you're talking about natural processes, I think again the occurrence of natural fire varies across ecoregions and ecosystems. So when you call fire natural, what I think of is lightning ignited wildfire. And actually, in the southern Appalachians and in much of the central hardwood forest, lightning ignited wildfire is not very common. It's not that we don't have wildfires, but like 90% of them or 95% of them are caused by humans. Arson, cigarettes, unattended campfires. That doesn't even include prescribed fires.
Yeah.
And historically, fires were also intentionally set by Native Americans and then later by settlers. But almost, I think it's fair to say, you might have some fire experts that would want to refute me, but I think it's fair to say.
I'm going to give them your email address, by the way.
It's not that we haven't had fire in these central hardwood forests, but I think most of the fire has been caused by humans intentionally to manage the landscape, even prehistorically, even by Native Americans.
Sure.
And if we didn't have Native Americans or Euro-Americans later, I don't think fire would be a very great occurrence in these moist, productive hardwood forests. I think it would happen sometimes, and it might happen after prolonged drought, if there happened to be a lightning strike, because our lightning season doesn't correspond with when the fuels are kind of ripe for catching fire. You yourself pointed out in the one podcast that I heard today with them, you were pointing out the accurate fact that we get very few burn days.
Yeah.
And that's because the fuels most of the time aren't conducive to catching fire. When they are conducive, which might be when things dry out a little bit in the fall, we don't have lightning.
Yeah.
So lightning and fuels condition doesn't really jive in our moist, productive forests. So there would be very few opportunities to have lightning-caused wildfires. They must have been human-caused most of the time.
Yeah. Well, that's an interesting line of discussion to have, because I wonder about this a lot, and I'm glad that you characterize what I said in the other one as accurate. But another observation that there's a couple of things. One, I'm thinking about, okay, what did lightning generated fire look like in, I don't know, 10,000 years ago, whatever. If we had lightning generated fire in the low country, could that have made it up into the mountains? So in other words,
I don't know what happened 10,000 years ago.
I know. That's why it's interesting to discuss about it. and we can completely speculate, and no one can prove it's right or wrong. So
exactly, it's this great opportunity. But I do think it would depend on the fuels conditions. So in the coastal plain and maybe even in the Piedmont, there was more continuous fuels probably historically. There was, grasses, wiregrass and things like that in the coastal plain. And so I don't know if it could have caught once it hit a bank of moist rhododendron and, depending on where there's coves, and a lot of it would depend on topography. Some of the steep southern facing slopes that have a lot of mountain laurel, if there was also a drought at the same time, maybe it could have creeped up.
Well, no,
And there's plenty of evidence that in certain topographic positions, there was more frequent fire, which
sure.
could have been wildfire, probably was. There's some species of plants that are adapted to fire, like table mountain pine, for example. It sheds its seed after fire because that releases the resins that hold the cones shut, and it can shed it. And that's what perpetuates it. So some of these obviously evolved with fire, but that doesn't mean you should generalize across the entire topography of the Southern Appalachians, which is very moist and very topographically diverse.
Yeah, no,
and even
I agree with
even the whole central forest region.
Right. Well, I just think it's interesting to think about those kinds of things. Like we did have, like you were saying, the landscape was not interrupted by as many fire breaks back then. We could probably pretty safely infer that. And like you were saying, during a drought year, maybe, I don't know, maybe, fire got set in the Piedmont and made it up there and set things on fire because it was a drought. And then if that happened every 10 or 15, 20 years, then you could have the fire frequency from lightning, perhaps. I was just thinking through that. I don't know that that's accurate or not. The other thing that I have observed, and I'm curious to get your thoughts on, because I think you'll probably be thinking about it very differently than I am, which is fun to talk about. One thing that has been evident in working on several properties now in upland hardwoods is when you go in and reduce the canopy. Particularly, I've been involved in a couple of places that have implemented a forest stand improvement where they go in and try to intentionally kill the unwanted wildlife species or unwanted plant species from a wildlife perspective. But those tend to be mesophytic plants that don't promote fire as well. So we kind of have done it similar to what you were talking about earlier, where we have gone in and changed the structure of the forest so that it's a very high sunlight rich environment in the understory, and also all of the ones that we killed were the things that are less pyrophytic. So maples or things like that don't tend to catch. And something that they were doing it for a different reason. They were just trying to promote wildlife habitat, but was something that I have sort of noticed in that process is the burn window seems to open when you get that open canopy and you start burning. You get an influx of some species that might support, fire during the lightning season. I just wonder, do you have that observation, and could that be playing an important role in that burn window and whether or not lightning was important? Like if you already had a savanna and woodland type of system, could lightning become important?
Oh, that's really interesting. Yes, if it was starkly different, I think that would definitely be true, because there are higher lightning strikes and fires spread and stuff like that in the coastal plain, where tends to be historically at least, tended to be a continuous field cover. So if you had structures like that in the central hardwoods and they were more abundant, there's many early explorers, when there were mostly Native Americans managing the landscape, they described, savannas and open woodlands and prairies and all kinds of crazy things you don't think of here in the central hardwood forest.
Yeah, I told you just before we went on the show that I had gone through a bunch of historical writings about turkeys, and the audience probably by now has gone on our social media and seen some of that. But one of the things that I posted that to me just really paints the picture you were just saying is some of the writings of Bartram and what he described. And of course, a lot of these explorers weren't describing things in a way that we could really quantify what the landscape looked like, but it still was pretty useful to paint a picture, I think. But exactly what you just said, essentially from the tallgrass prairie east, a large portion of the landscape was described as open forest, or some sort of savanna or what is it? What did they call it? Savanna or woodland type of structure. So
interesting.
Yeah.
But I do think I think most of that was created by humans, by indigenous people. And I don't think it would have been there without them.
Mm-hmm. Well,
I'm sure those writings are a little bit biased because they were describing where they were traveling through, and they weren't traveling, over
In the
Plains
place.
Dome, and
Yeah.
they were traveling probably mostly in the easy places to go where Native Americans lived.
Right. Which was probably those open forest conditions.
Right. And where they were managing the land.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a good point. So it's interesting to think about it, and we're having to speculate and draw inference from imperfect data and all those sorts of things to do it.
It's really interesting. And before you try to think of, well, what happened, what would it have been like before Native Americans? But before Native Americans, like 10, 12,000 years ago, this was tundra and spruce and jack pine forest. Boreal forest.
Yeah, it wasn't even the same assemblage of organisms at that point because of ice.
Yeah, we had mammoths and mastodons and ground sloths. I mean, it was like Jurassic Park.
Some of it is.
You can't really find that holy spot where it was only natural disturbances and natural processes without humans. But you could decide that humans are part of the ecosystem,
right?
Or you could decide that you don't care how it was naturally. You want to manage for certain things. Like if you want shortleaf pine forests, you have to manage for it. And who cares if it was natural or human managed in the distant past? It was still there. And if you want it, that's fine. Yeah. You just don't have to say that it's the holy state.
Right. Yeah. Well, it's definitely a matter of perspective and how you couch that. And I think most of us can agree that we would like to have indigo buntings. Right. We would rather them be here than not. So that will require having the kinds of structure they need. We have quite a few species on the conservation concern list that are associated with these, or either early succession or some sort of open forest condition like you're describing. And most of us can agree that we would like for those to stick around. So, I'm with you. Who cares?
That's reason enough. Just state your goals, and doesn't matter what historical reference it was, unless you really want it to be.
Right. We know that open forests were probably a much bigger portion of the landscape than they are currently, and we know that there are a whole bunch of species of conservation concern that respond well to those conditions. So. That's good enough for me.
Yeah, me too.
So, well, I guess to go back to that question, that's also an interesting line of thought. Regardless of who or what created that kind of forest condition, do you think that it could have made the forest more prone to fire? Like if you had that open forest condition and then lightning strikes in that, it may actually facilitate lightning becoming more important. So you sort of have this additive
yeah,
thing.
I mean, that's possible. And it's also possible that it made management easier because, the first 50 times you did it, it would have been hard to get fire in there, but maybe the 51st time it would be different.
Yeah. A few of the high severity fires and then low severity becomes much easier. That's for sure. Yeah. That's it's really interesting to think about. I go round and round about this all the time in my head. So it's nice to talk to someone else that thinks about it a little bit.
Yeah, I do too. And there were a lot of other changes that, that happened historically too, that have really altered our forests. When you talk about oak regeneration and fire, for example, we also had the American chestnut dying out, 100 years ago or 90 years ago. And that changed the lighting conditions. And I mean, there's all kinds of stuff that goes on.
Well, and talking about the flammability of species, it was pretty striking to me. And I don't know if I've brought it up on this podcast. I know that I've talked to Morgan Varner about it, who was an author on the paper, that some of the fuels things about the American chestnut, have you seen some of the literature on flammability of different substrates? There was one recently that had American chestnut as one of the species they tested. It was the most flammable leaf litter out of all of them. It was like 50 species or something that they tested, including several pines. They had the leaf litter in it, and the American chestnut was the most flammable out of all of them.
Wow.
I was pretty struck by that. It's like, wow, okay. So that's another thing we don't even think about is we had another species that was apparently dominating at least portions of that region that was very flammable, and it's no longer there. So it's interesting to think about.
There is. I wanted to put in a plug for things besides birds.
Sure. Wait, are there things other than birds? I know when you say birds, I think of turkey birds, and you're thinking about other birds. Lots of beautiful birds, but are there other? Yeah, go ahead, please.
Well, I mean, since your audience is interested in non-game, they might not just be interested in birds. So I just wanted to add a few little. Chris Moorman and I, and again, graduate students, have worked a lot on reptiles and amphibians in response to fire as well. And the biggest, I'd say the take-home message that we've found is, once again, low severity burn doesn't do very much in general. But if you open the canopy, it promotes certain lizards, like fence lizards and five-line skinks, that like warmer areas to thermoregulate and lay their eggs. And so it actually, I don't know if they're coming into the burns or if their populations actually go up, because either way you would catch more. And so it's hard to know the difference unless you're actually tracking individuals.
Yeah.
But they do become more abundant in these more open areas, including shelterwood harvest. Once again, you see the same kind of response to silviculturally created, opened up habitat and high severity burn. And the response of salamanders that you would think would be very, very sensitive. The salamanders, like most amphibians, have moist skin. They, some of them breathe through their skin, but they have to stay moist in general. And you would think that they would decline a lot after high severity burns. And they do decline after shelterwood harvests. So they do not like shelterwood harvests, and they take a while to rebound. Once again, it's a matter of scale. So if you have a 20-acre shelterwood harvest and it's surrounded by mature forest, it's not going to impact these species unless you're talking about an endangered species. Most of them are extremely common terrestrial salamanders. So I don't get too worried about it, but they do show a little decline after shelterwoods. But our results for the wildfire, for the high severity fire, are kind of nebulous. I don't know that they definitely do decline after high severity fire, but it might change their behavior. They might, in fact, you often see a little spike. Some people have shown a decline probably because of behavior, because they're spending more time huddled under their cover objects to give them more moisture, because the land is dried out a little bit for a while so it could be behavioral. But we actually, Chris and I have noticed that there seems to be a little increase in activity right after burns by salamanders. I don't know if it's because it depends a lot on your trapping method. Some people use searches, so they're looking under cover. So that's already biasing it a little bit because they're not seeing what they're doing when they're not under cover. Yeah. They're looking under cover boards or coarse woody debris. So that's different it's a different way to trap and interpret the pitfall traps, which is what we use. We put out, buckets dug into the ground, and they actually fall into the buckets. So you catch them in the daytime and the nighttime, and when it's raining and when it's not raining, you catch them continually. So you get a little better read of what they're doing.
Assuming they ever come out from under their cover anyway.
Assuming they ever come out. Yeah. But we've oddly, and it's not statistically significant, but you definitely see a weird little spike in activity after burning for that season, which is pretty interesting. Yeah.
It makes you wonder, are they just trying to get out of there? Or
they could be.
Yeah. Well, that's really interesting. It also made me think about, okay, when would they rebound? And I started thinking about the succession of plants, and maybe it's when the shading, or is it when all the snags fall down and now there's lots of good stuff to hide under? So from that perspective, I don't feel, I think there's a lot of studies and they don't all show the same thing. So I don't really want to make huge generalizations. Sure.
But I think the studies of shelter woods or clear cuts show it takes quite a while for them to rebound. It probably depends on whether they're actually being directly impacted by these treatments, like if they're dying, or if they're just being behaviorally impacted. I mean, if there are actually fewer of them in those areas, then it would probably be a matter of how long it takes them to reproduce to get back up to their original populations, and how fast they can come in from the existing forest along the edges where there still are plenty, almost surely, how recolonize. So it probably depends on that. So I don't really know, but I would imagine that as the shrubs recover and you get more shade, and there's more moisture in the soil and there's more leaf litter, that the conditions would be fine for them in not too long. But I'm not going to say how long they take, because I think it varies among studies and treatments.
Sure. Well, it may even vary with the same treatment in different places. So yeah, very interesting. Well, I thought that I saw recently that you had done some stuff even with insects, right? Like spiders.
I'm by no means am I an insect expert, but I've opportunistically, we have bugs that fall into these pitfall traps that are designed for reptiles and amphibians. And I thought, well, why are we going to waste this data? We'll just collect the bugs and we'll give it to a bug expert to analyze, and we'll have a little interesting study. So I've done that, but there was a colleague named Josh Campbell, who actually worked in the fire and fire surrogate studies specifically. He is an expert in it. Yeah. And he was specifically looking at pollinators and other things too. Spiders. He put out colored bowls of water to attract insects. And he found that there are more pollinating insects and flying kind of bugs that come into, again, the high severity burn areas.
Oh, wow.
And actually in this Shelterwood study that Mariah Whitehead and Drew Lanham and I worked on, and they did a little study of bugs in these open areas due to shelterwood harvests. And they also found a greater abundance of flying and foliar insects, the ones that pollinate, and because they're probably attracted by the flush of primary productivity, the leaves. After you cut, things come back with a vengeance, including leaves and seedlings and saplings and shrubs, and they flower too, and they produce a lot of fruit, by the way.
Oh yeah. Yeah, I know about that.
I think things are coming in because of that, the foliage and the flowers, and that increases the amount of insects, which could attract the birds. Yeah. So you also see more birds coming in. They're probably coming in for the heavy shrub cover. They like that. A lot of studies show that parents will bring their fledglings into these young areas, even if they're forest birds like ovenbirds. They'll come into these thick stands because it's an ideal place to teach the young how to forage without getting eaten alive themselves.
Yeah. That's important. That's actually rule number one. Don't get eaten.
Exactly. So these young areas, whether by wildfire or shelterwood harvests or other kinds of treatments, they can be real hotspots of action for these bird families, and very important. And then, of course, there's also a huge amount of fruit produced in these young stands, like 20 times more fruit in a young stand within about 3 years or so compared to the mature forest. Yeah. So there's all kinds of things that could be attracting wildlife.
Yeah, and I've done quite a bit of work, and I know our audience has heard about it because I throw it in there occasionally. There's a really strong magnet effect on a lot of species, and you're describing reasons why that would occur for a whole suite or a whole community of species. This magnet effect following fire, provided you have enough sunlight for the vegetation to respond to it. Another really interesting thing that is sort of another angle that the audience may not fully understand, that this is causing some of the stuff you're describing, that I have worked on, is actually looking at the flush of vegetation, so that tender succulent green up, so to speak. It itself is higher quality, at least ephemerally for a short period of time. The leaves on those resprouting plants are much higher quality than they would have been if it was just a new leaf on the same plant without it being top killed. So the new tender succulent tissue itself is also higher quality for herbivores, which probably promotes an abundance of leaf-eating insects that a lot of other species are eating, or probably explains some of the magnet effect on deer and other vertebrate herbivores as well. So Yeah, it's really interesting, the suite of cascading events that happens in the community. It sounds like a lot of the things that I think about with these game species is also applying to a lot of the things that you think about more often with these non-game species.
Yeah, it really is interesting.
Very cool.
And what's especially interesting also is just how it changes so fast. Like if you want to have these open forests, you have to continually make them either through silviculture or maintain them by repeated burning or whatever.
Yeah.
Because after 10 years or so, they're effectively no longer habitat for all of these things that we're talking about.
Yeah. Yeah. That's a good point. It's not just a go do it one time and then you're done. If you want that to persist, you have to continuously go in and you have to continuously disturb things to maintain disturbance-dependent species.
Yeah, you got to have some kind of rotation or areas that you're continually disturbing or whatever. And of course, you want to leave some mature forest too. I'm not advocating disturbing everything, mind you.
I bring that in all the time. You don't want everything to. That's the biodiversity you're talking about right there. The landscape diversity. There is a place for things that are not disturbed.
Right.
That late successional thing, that's pretty rare on the landscape as well.
Yeah.
Just having that undisturbed landscape that hasn't had any influence from any of these things for a long time.
Right. And I think one of the interesting things as well, an interesting question is at what level of canopy reduction do you start to find a response? Like in the first study that I showed you, we talked about the fire and fire. There was a contrast. There was low severity and high severity, but there wasn't the gradient. And the wildfire study that Chris and I and some others are working on, we do have that gradient. And what we're seeing is the high severity promotes disturbance-dependent species. The low severity does nothing, just like we already thought. But in between, at some point, as trees begin to die in the moderate low or the moderate categories, and then they die over time too, because a delayed mortality effect happens. They were like injured badly, and then they more and more die over time, even from that initial fire, even though it was only moderately low severity. You do see a little more gradual. It's more gradual than in the high severity, but you do see a little increase in total bird abundance and richness. What you don't see is an abundance of these disturbance-dependent species. They only like the high. But you do see a little, and so that kind of makes you think about maybe you should study at what point do these changes happen, and
some threshold,
and how long should you study it? Because possibly a moderate severity fire may not initially show a lot of change, but 6 years later, after more of the trees have died, you might see more effect. So it opens up a lot of plots for further research.
Yeah, for sure. And a lot of these things that I think we talk about it plenty as scientists, and the audience out there may not think about it. It may take decades for some of these things for us to really understand. If you just did things for long term and how they ultimately affect community assembly and which species fare well and which don't. That may take a long term that we haven't even gotten to yet because we haven't been studying it long enough.
Exactly. I mean, there's a shortcut around that. You could go to burn stands that are already 5 years old, 10 years old, and look at a chrono sequence that way. But it's not really quite the same, because it's not the same place where you can, you could have slight differences in these kinds of stands.
And it's hard to identify those thresholds as well, because you don't have that continuous change to see when things really, shift. So,
right. There's a lot of value in long-term research, I believe.
Yeah, I agree. Well, that was a great conversation. I really appreciate you telling us about all that cool stuff that you've been doing for your research career. Are there any take-home messages? I always like to try to let the whoever I have on the show give us some take-homes, or anything that you would like to tell people that you haven't already.
I think we've covered a lot of it. I guess the big take-homes are that low severity fire, like mostly occurs with managers who are doing prescribed burns, it really doesn't do very much to affect anything, really anything but birds.
Unless there's adequate sunlight.
Well, low severity generally doesn't achieve that. That's the thing. You got to have a higher, you got to kill some trees.
Right. Well, that's what I meant. Like if you go in with silviculture and kill some trees and then have low severity.
Right. A combination approach could achieve that, but just low severity prescribed burning alone is not going to do very much. Maybe repeated burning over many, many, many times, even more than what we've studied, might achieve a little bit of mortality, but it's not going to cause dramatic effects. And high severity burning does a lot of things for the disturbance-dependent species and doesn't negatively affect most other bird species. And it also is good for reptiles, particularly lizards. So I'd say those are the two main take-home points. And finally, that in my observation, just looking at studies I've done and other people have done, silviculture can achieve a lot of the same things that a high-severity wildfire can. But a lot of these innuendos need further study.
Yeah. Well, that's a good thing because we need things to study, right? Otherwise, there would be no need for us.
That's the thing about research is it's one study doesn't answer everything. It takes a lot of different angles and time and energy and creative thoughts to eventually move it forward and fill in the missing pieces of the puzzle. Yeah.
It's good stuff. Well, so if people are interested in following up with you or have questions or thoughts or anything, is there a place that they can find you?
Absolutely. I have an email address. That's the best way to reach me.
Okay.
If you're fully free to provide that, you have it, or I can send it to you.
I joked earlier that I was going to provide everybody your email. I wasn't kidding, actually. That was real. No. So we'll put it in the show notes and any papers that you've discussed. If people want to do that, we can put the links in the show notes so that people can go and see those as well. But great conversation. I really appreciate you taking the time to talk to us and educate us on all these things.
It's been really fun and interesting to talk to you. So thank you for inviting me.
Yeah, well, I really appreciate it. Thanks everybody out there for continuing to listen. We really appreciate it.
All right. Take care, Marcus.
Fire University is part of the Natural Resource University podcast network funded by the Renewable Resources Extension Act. If you like what you heard today in this episode, please follow us on all the social media platforms at UF Deer Lab.